One thing that makes diving popular is that you can enjoy it in so many different environments, each with characteristics that make it special. Besides coral reefs and temperate ocean, diving's popular in lakes, reservoirs, springs, flooded quarries, rivers, and human-made dive sites. In all of them, 6 environmental conditions affect you as a diver, though how and the extent depend on the environment. In most environments, temperature varies seasonally, but water also tends to form temperature layers, getting colder as you go deeper. The depth at which you find colder water depends on the environment, season, and water motion. What's important is to wear exposure protection based on your planned depth. Visibility can range from just a meter or a few feet to more than 30 meters or 100 feet. It's usually defined as how far you can recognize a diver horizontally. Like a dust storm in air, lots of particles in the water reduce the visibility. Water movement, weather, plankton, and the bottom composition can all contribute to suspended particles and lower visibility. Lower visibility doesn't necessarily mean a poor dive. What you see is more important than how far. But lower visibility can make it harder to stay with buddies, so stay close, take your time, and watch each other. Navigation usually requires more attention, and it's easier to get disoriented while descending and ascending. As you've learned, it's easiest to descend and ascend along the bottom or a line, and this is especially true in lower visibility. But you can use your dive computer to watch your depth if you don't have a reference. If the visibility is so poor that you wouldn't have fun, it's usually best to not make the dive or end it if you've already started. Clear water can cause disorientation too. Again, a reference helps. You can also get too far from your buddy even though you can see each other. Remember to stay close. The 2 types of water movement that affect you as a diver are waves and current. We'll look at how waves affect diving later in this section. Currents affect diving because you can't swim against any but a very weak one. So you need to use the appropriate techniques. Because they're often strongest at the surface and weakest near the bottom, plan a dive in a current so you avoid long surface swims. Begin your dive swimming into a mild current. That way, when you turn the dive, the current helps carry you toward your exit point rather than pushing you away from it. Especially on the surface, don't swim against anything but a very weak current. Doing so can exhaust you. Swim across the current to reach shore, to reach a line trailed behind the dive boat for this purpose, or to get out of the current, depending upon the situation. When boat diving, if you can't get to the boat due to a current, remain calm, stay with your buddy, inflate your BCD, and use your signaling devices to get the boat to pick you up. Drift diving helps you deal with currents by letting you float with them. It's an exhilarating way to dive that's popular where strong oceanic currents prevail. You can learn the techniques in the PADI Drift Diver course. The bottom composition may be silt or mud, sand, rock, coral, or vegetation, with more than one common at most dive sites. Regardless of type, avoid bottom contact as much as possible so you don't stir it up and reduce the visibility to help avoid cuts and stings, and so you don't damage aquatic life. Stay neutrally buoyant with your gear streamlined well above the bottom. If you must contact the bottom, choose a place without sensitive aquatic life and hazards and settle onto it gently, ideally with little more than fin-tip contact. When you're close to the bottom, watch where you put your hands and feet. When wading in or out during a shore dive, some bottom contact is unavoidable. If necessary where you're diving, wear wetsuit boots to reduce the risk of cuts from rocks or stings from stepping on aquatic life. Wade just deep enough to start swimming. Sunlight affects how much light you have underwater, but it can also cause sunburn, perhaps the most common injury divers get. But it's easy to avoid. Use sunscreen and stay in the shade when you can. Cover up with clothing and remember that you can still burn when it's overcast. Repeated long-term exposure to bright sunlight can damage your eyes, so protect them with good quality sunglasses. There's great diving in both freshwater and saltwater. Your skills apply to both, but a few differences generally apply. Freshwater is less dense and you don't need as much weight, so check proper weighting when going from salt to freshwater or vice versa. Marine environments tend to have more aquatic life and more water motion, waves, currents, and tides. Freshwater environments are more likely to have bottoms that stir up easily and have distinct cold water layers as you go deeper within the recreational depth range. As a diver, you develop the ability to assess dive conditions. You learn to do this from your instructor, other divers, and experience, so that you can assess dive conditions based on the weather, season, water motion, how the water looks, reports online or from other divers, and dives you've made at similar sites. Your assessment includes deciding whether or not to dive. If you have a concern, get more information about how to handle it if you can. If you can't address the issue, then go elsewhere or dive another day. Remember that ultimately, you decide to dive. You are responsible for your own safety, so only you can make the final decision to dive. As discussed in Section 1, an environmental orientation helps you learn to address what's unique to an environment. You learn to assess conditions and to eliminate potential concerns. Orientations improve your safety, but they also make your diving more interesting, rewarding, and enjoyable. Every diver has limits. Whether you're new or very experienced, dive within your limits. This means you don't exceed your training and your experience limits. It also means you stay within your comfort limits. This is important because data suggests that failure to dive within personal limits contributes to incidents and accidents. It does this because some forms of diving may have hazards that may not be obvious. It takes training to recognize and avoid them. It can cause false security. Sometimes, if nothing goes wrong, a diver exceeds limits, like entering some wrecks without proper training or gear, and gets away with it. Unfortunately, this encourages doing it again. When a problem arises, though, the diver is completely unprepared to deal with it. Anxiety can cause divers to neglect potential problems. This happens when divers know they've exceeded their limits and focus on that so much it distracts them from other concerns. Expand your limits by continuing your education and gradually gaining experience. Don't let peer pressure influence you to dive beyond your limits or comfort. Suggest a more conservative dive, or dive with another buddy who will dive within your limits. This is not only the better choice for safety, but you'll enjoy yourself more because you can dive with confidence instead of worry. The unique life you see underwater is one of diving's special appeals. It may be your main reason for diving. Most aquatic organisms are fascinating, beautiful, and harmless. As a diver, your interactions can be passive or active. Generally, interact passively, which means leaving aquatic life undisturbed. Swim slowly and smoothly, sensitive to the underwater world around you. The less you disturb, the more you see. Active interactions are those that directly affect aquatic organisms. Some, like touching, moving, or frightening them, are harmful and should be avoided. Some active interactions are reasonable, but more may be harmful, even when that's not what you intend. So keep your interactions passive. Most animals you see are harmless, but a few can injure you. Broadly, we can group these as those that can sting and/or puncture, and those that can bite. Those that can sting or puncture include jellyfish, fire coral and their relatives, spined fish like lionfish and scorpionfish, stingrays, sea urchins, and cone shells. Those that bite include moray eels, sharks, barracuda, octopuses, and lobsters, and crab. Most aquatic life injuries result from a diver being careless and provoking a defense reaction. You can greatly reduce the risk of aquatic life injuries by treating all organisms with respect. Stay well off the bottom, wear an exposure suit and gloves if allowed in the area, and watch where you put your hands and feet. Don't touch aquatic animals, particularly those you don't recognize. If you see a potentially aggressive animal, like a large shark, remain still and calm, on or near the bottom. Don't swim toward it, but keep an eye on it. Chances are it's just passing through. But if it appears aggressive or too curious for your comfort, calmly swim to your exit on the bottom and leave the water. Most aquatic life injuries are mild, but can range from annoying to life-threatening. In all cases, give priority to breathing, providing CPR, and controlling severe bleeding as needed. Provide first aid and seek emergency medical care for clearly serious injuries, severe reactions, or those that don't respond to treatment. You learn more about these types of emergencies in the PADI Rescue Diver and Emergency First Response Primary and Secondary Care courses. When it comes to injuries by aquatic life, you normally think of animals, but kelp and other vegetation can have some hazard potential. The primary one is entanglement, so keep your kit streamlined and stay out of dense growth areas. If you get snagged, back up, but don't turn. That tends to make things worse by wrapping it around you. Get your buddy to help free you if necessary. Shore diving is popular and your only option in some places. Begin a shore dive by evaluating conditions and planning the dive with your buddies. Typically, you gear up with everything except your mask, fins, and snorkel. Then, walk to the water and put on your mask and snorkel before you enter. You may wade in and back out, but in some locations, you may enter with a giant stride from a dock and exit up a ladder, or use stairs to and from the water. If you wade in from shore, pay attention to bottom composition and hazardous or fragile aquatic life you might step on. Wearing foot protection may be wise. A common technique is to wade until you reach water deep enough in which to swim and then put your fins on. Then, depending on the dive site, you may descend and swim out on the bottom, or swim on the surface and descend along a float line. Generally, you ascend and exit by reversing these steps. Keep in mind that you can't wade in some environments, so you need to reach water deep enough in which to swim some other way. And when planning your dive, remember to plan to save enough air to use during your exit. Some dive sites require entering through mild surf. As a new diver, this means entering on a gently sloped beach with waves about waist high or less. Understanding water motion principles will help you enter through mild surf. Waves break, that is, form surf, in water slightly deeper than their own height. The bottom drags, and then they tip over. So, by noting where waves break, you can get an idea of the depth. Waves cause surge and undertow. Surge is a back and forth motion caused by waves passing overhead. The main concern is to not let it push you against rocks or anything hazardous. As you get deeper, surge dissipates. Undertow is water from breaking waves flowing back to sea under the incoming waves. The larger the waves and steeper the beach, the stronger the undertow. The main concern is that it can cause you to lose your balance, but in mild surf, it isn't very strong. Waves usually approach shore at an angle, which causes a longshore current. A longshore current flows parallel to the shoreline and tends to move you downshore during the dive. You can plan for this by swimming into the current during the dive or planning to exit somewhere downshore. Sometimes, Waves push over an obstruction that blocks water from flowing back to sea on the bottom. When this happens, the water may funnel seaward through a narrow opening. Past the opening, the flow dissipates. This is called a rip current. Rip currents can be alarming because they carry you away from the shore rapidly, and they're too strong to swim against. Most accidents involving rip currents result from panic, not the current. If you get in one, don't fight it. Inflate your BCD and swim at a sustainable pace across it until you're clear. Then swim back to shore. Some areas may have recommendations specific to local rip currents. A wind blowing from shore can push surface water out to sea. This causes an upwelling, which is deeper water rising to replace the surface water. Upwellings tend to make dive conditions clearer but cooler, so you may need more exposure protection. The moon and the sun's gravities pull on the oceans, causing a slight bulge. As the Earth turns, this causes the tides, a rise and fall in the sea level. Tides cause currents, especially when they flow in and out of a narrow area, affect the depth, and can change the visibility. Tidal changes range from significant to unnoticeable, but they're very predictable. Generally, the best time to dive is at high tide. You can find local tide times and heights online or with an app. If the tide changes are significant, ask a local dive professional for an orientation to local techniques. Now let's look at the techniques you use to enter through mild surf. Start by watching where the waves break and their pattern, so you enter when waves are absent or at their smallest. Enter with everything in place except your fins, breathing from your regulator, and have just enough air in your BCD to float. With your buddy, wade quickly to deeper water. When a wave comes, stand like this for stability, and so your mask and regulator don't get dislodged. If you're using a float, tow it behind you. In water deep enough to swim, pull on your fins and surface swim out. The idea is to pass through the surf as quickly as you can. Switch to your snorkel to save air if you're going to surface swim a bit before descending. At the end of the dive, surface outside the surf zone. Check the wave pattern and time your entry for a lull. When ready, switch to your regulator and swim shoreward on the surface with your buddy. In water shallow enough in which to wade, deflate your BCD so you can stand and walk firmly. Watching the waves, remove your fins and wade ashore quickly. Brace as waves pass like you did before. If you stumble and waves make it hard to get up, don't try. Just crawl until you're almost out, then get your buddy to help you up. As a diver, you'll almost certainly dive from a boat. To prepare for a boat dive, inspect your gear ahead of time and be sure it's marked so it doesn't get mixed with someone else's. Space will be limited, so pack so you can work in and out of your bag. Put what you need last on the bottom and what you need first on top. Take what you want for your time aboard: dry clothes, beverages and snacks, sunscreen, towels, and so on. Prepare yourself by being well rested and properly fed, but also by taking steps to prevent seasickness. Seasickness rarely has long-term health effects, but it can ruin your trip. Suitable medication is available over the counter in most areas, but consult your physician if you have questions about what's appropriate for you. Underway, stay in open, fresh air and look at the horizon. If you start to feel